There is a face from the 1930s that almost everyone on Earth would recognize. A little girl with golden curls and dimples so deep they looked carved into her cheeks, tap dancing across a movie screen while the entire country watched. She was 5 years old when she became the #1 box office star in America. Not the #1 child star, the #1 star, period. Bigger than Clark Gable, bigger than Joan Crawford. The President of the United States said that as long as the country had her, everything would be all right. She saved a movie studio from bankruptcy. She lifted a nation's spirits during the worst economic crisis in its history. She was America's little sweetheart, and the whole world smiled when she smiled. But behind the dimples and the tap shoes, and the 40 films she made before she turned 12, so there was a childhood that looked nothing like the one the cameras showed. She was locked in a dark, freezing punishment box on a studio lot before she was old enough for kindergarten. Her birth certificate was forged. A producer exposed himself to her when she was 12 years old. She earned $3 million before puberty, and almost all of it was gone by the time she was old enough to ask where it went. This is not the Shirley Temple story most people know. This is the one that happened when the cameras were off. Let's go back to the beginning. A modest house in Santa Monica, where a mother's ambition was about to change American culture forever. George Francis Temple was a banker, not a powerful banker, not the kind of man who shaped financial policy or sat on important boards. But he was a branch manager at the California First National Bank in Los Angeles, a man who went to work in the morning and came home in the evening and occupied his place in the household with the quiet, reliable presence of someone who understood that his role was to keep things steady. He was born in 1888 in Pennsylvania, had served briefly in the military, and had settled into a life that was respectable, comfortable, and entirely unremarkable. If George Temple had been the only force in that household, the name Temple would mean nothing to anyone reading this today. But George was not the only force. There was also Gertrude. Gertrude Amelia Krieger was the daughter of German immigrants, a woman who had grown up with aspirations toward the performing arts that her own circumstances had never allowed her to fulfill. But she had wanted to dance. She had wanted to be on a stage. Life had given her something different. It had given her a husband, a house in Santa Monica, and eventually 3 children. George Jr. arrived in 1919. Jack followed in 1920. And then on April the 23rd, 1928, Shirley Jane Temple was born, the 3rd child, the only daughter. And from the moment she arrived, Gertrude looked at her differently than she had looked at the boys. It was not that Gertrude didn't love her sons. By all accounts, she did. But the boys were their father's children in temperament, steady, quiet, unremarkable in the way that comfortable middle-class boys in Southern California often were in that era. Shirley was something else. Gertrude saw it early. The child moved to music before she could form complete sentences. She mimicked voices from the radio. She performed instinctively, naturally, in the way that certain children do when the impulse is genuine and not yet shaped by anyone else's ambition. But it was about to be shaped. Gertrude enrolled Shirley at Meglin's dance studio when the child was 3 years old. 3, not 5, not 6. 3. Gertrude drove her to every class, sat in the back of the room during every session, watched every step, corrected every posture, and made it clear to anyone paying attention that this particular child was not there for fun. This was preparation. George, for his part, did not object. He did not intervene. He did not ask whether a 3-year-old needed professional dance training, or whether the intensity of his wife's focus on their daughter might be something worth examining. He went to the bank. He came home. He kept things steady. That was his role, and he played it without deviation for the rest of his life. The 2 brothers, George Jr. and Jack, slipped quietly to the margins of the family story almost from the moment Shirley began to dance. They grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, and watched from an increasing distance as everything in the Temple household began to orbit around one person. They were not mistreated. They were simply no longer the point. And the point, the entire point, was about to walk onto a studio lot for the first time and into a world that no 3-year-old should have been asked to enter. In 1931, a talent scout from a small studio called Educational Pictures visited Meglin's dance studio looking for children. Not for a children's film. Not for anything that would make sense to a modern audience hearing about it for the first time. Educational Pictures was producing a series of one-reel short films called Baby Burlesks. The concept was simple and, by any reasonable modern standard, disturbing. Toddlers between the ages of 3 and 5 were dressed in adult costumes from the waist up and diapers fastened with oversized safety pins from the waist down. They were then directed to act out parodies of popular adult films. Shirley Temple was 3 years old when she was cast. The films had titles like War Babies, in which toddlers sat in a mock bar while a 3-year-old Shirley played a French bar girl, and Glad Rags to Riches, in which she portrayed a nightclub performer. The children delivered scripted dialogue. They mimicked adult romantic behavior. And they performed scenes that were designed to be funny precisely because the performers were so impossibly young. These were not home movies. They were commercial productions distributed to theaters across the country. Adults watched them and laughed. The studio made money. And the children on those sets lived under a system of discipline that Shirley Temple did not speak about publicly for more than 50 years. There was a box, a sound booth on the studio lot, dark, windowless, cold. A block of ice sat on the floor to keep the temperature low. When a child on set misbehaved or forgot a line, or cried, or did any of the things that 3- and 4-year-old children do because they are 3 and 4 years old, they were taken to the box and locked inside, alone, in the dark, until someone decided they had learned their lesson. As Shirley Temple was 3 years old the first time she was put in the black box. She wrote about it decades later in her 1988 autobiography, Child Star. The memory had not faded. The cold had not faded. The darkness had not faded. She carried it for more than half a century before she put the words on paper. And even then, even in a book written by a woman in her 60s who had lived a full and accomplished life, the passage about the box reads like something that still had its hands around her. Gertrude was on set during these productions. She was present in the way she was always present, watching, managing, positioning her daughter for whatever came next. What she knew about the box, what she saw, what she chose to do or not do about it, is not entirely resolved in the autobiography. Shirley did not accuse her mother directly, but she did not exonerate her either. The silence on that particular question is its own kind of answer. The pay was $10 a day. The child worked full days on a studio lot under conditions that would be criminal by any modern labor standard, and her family received $10 for each one. But the Baby Burlesks were not the destination. They were the audition. Shirley's face, her timing, her preternatural ability to hit a mark and deliver a line at an age when most children are still learning to share toys, caught the attention of people at much larger studios. By 1933, she had appeared in small roles in feature films, and then Fox Film Corporation brought her in for a screen test, and the screen test changed everything. By 1934, Fox Film Corporation was dying. The studio that had once been one of the most powerful in Hollywood was bleeding money, crushed by the weight of the Great Depression and a series of financial miscalculations that had left it teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Theaters were closing across the country. Audiences who could barely afford food were not spending what little they had on movie tickets. The entire industry was contracting, and Fox was contracting faster than most. The studio needed a miracle. What it got was a 5-year-old girl. Stand Up and Cheer was released in April 1934. It was a modest production. a musical revue built around the premise of a government department created to lift the nation's spirits through entertainment. Shirley Temple appeared in a single number, performing a song called Baby Take a Bow alongside the actor James Dunn. She was on screen for only a few minutes. It did not matter. She stole the entire picture. Audiences who had come for the adult stars left talking about the child, with the curls and the dimples who had tap-danced her way into their hearts, with a confidence that seemed almost impossible for someone her age. Fox signed her to a contract immediately. What followed was one of the most extraordinary runs in the history of American cinema. Bright Eyes was released later that year, featuring the song On the Good Ship Lollipop, which became one of the most recognized melodies in American popular culture. By the end of 1934, Shirley Temple was the #1 box office star in the United States. She was 6 years old. She held that position for 4 consecutive years, from 1935 through 1938. No child before or since has matched that achievement. So no adult matched it in her era either. She was bigger than Gable, bigger than Crawford, bigger than every established star the studio system had spent decades building. And she had done it before she lost her baby teeth. Her films were credited with saving Fox from collapse. The revenue she generated allowed the studio to stabilize, to merge with 20th Century Pictures in 1935, and to emerge as 20th Century Fox, one of the dominant forces in Hollywood for decades to come. The math was simple and staggering. A kindergartner had rescued a corporation. In February 1935, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded Shirley Temple a special Juvenile Academy Award in recognition of her contributions to screen entertainment. She was 6 years old. She remains the youngest person ever to receive an Oscar of any kind. So the record has stood for nearly 90 years. No one has come close to breaking it. And then there was Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, speaking during the darkest years of the Depression, reportedly said that as long as the country had Shirley Temple, we would be all right. It was meant as a tribute. It was received as a tribute. It has been repeated for decades as evidence of just how beloved she was. But there is another way to hear that sentence. A way that lands differently when you remember who he was talking about. He was talking about a child, a 6-year-old girl whose job, apparently, was to make an entire nation feel better about itself. The emotional well-being of a country placed on the shoulders of a kindergartner. That was the gift America gave Shirley Temple in exchange for saving its spirits, as a weight no child should ever have been asked to carry. Every night, before Shirley Temple went to sleep, her mother set her hair in pin curls. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly 56. Gertrude had determined that 56 was the number required to produce the precise arrangement of ringlets that the camera demanded. Not 55, not 57, 56, every single night, for years. The child would sit still while her mother worked through each section of hair, wrapping and pinning with the efficiency of someone performing a task that had been done 1,000 times before and would be done 1,000 times again. This was not vanity. This was maintenance. The curls were the product, and the product had to be perfect. That number, 56, should tell you more about Shirley Temple's childhood than almost any other detail from those years. It tells you that nothing was left to chance. It tells you that the image mattered more than the comfort. It tells you that even the hours that should have belonged to rest and softness and the ordinary rhythms of childhood were bent toward the demands of an industry that had decided this particular child was worth more money than most adults would see in a lifetime. The curls were not just hair, they were a contract, and the contract was non-negotiable. Shirley did not attend regular school until she was 12 years old. California law required studios to provide 3 hours of education per day for child performers, and Fox complied in the technical sense. There were tutors on set, there were lessons between takes. But 3 hours of fragmented instruction, squeezed between lighting setups and costume changes, and the endless repetition of scenes is not the same as sitting in a classroom with other children your own age, learning not just arithmetic, but how to be a person among other people. Shirley had no consistent friends who were children. Her companions were adult actors and crew members. They were often kind to her. Many of them genuinely cared for her. But kindness from adults is not the same as friendship with peers. She was surrounded by people and utterly alone in a way that only someone who grew up that way can fully understand. And then there was the matter of how the world saw her. In 1937, the British writer Graham Greene published a review of Shirley Temple's film Wee Willie Winkie in a magazine called Night and Day. But the review was not like other reviews. Greene suggested, in language that was both careful and unmistakable, that Shirley Temple's appeal to adult audiences was fundamentally sexual in nature. He wrote about her dimpled depravity. He referenced middle-aged men and clergymen. He described a coquetry that he considered dubious at best. The review named something that the industry preferred to leave unnamed. It asked why, exactly, grown men were so captivated by a 9-year-old girl in short skirts. Fox sued for libel. The studio won. Greene was ordered to pay damages. Night and Day magazine went out of business entirely. The matter was settled in court and never spoken of again in polite company. But the question Greene had asked did not disappear simply because a judge ruled against him. It hung in the air, unanswered, for anyone willing to look at the phenomenon honestly. And if the Greene review was strange, what happened the following year was stranger still. Someone wrote a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, claiming that Shirley Temple was not actually a child at all. The letter alleged that she was an adult dwarf, a 30-year-old woman posing as a little girl to deceive the American public. Hoover, rather than dismissing the claim as the obvious nonsense it was, ordered an investigation. FBI agents were assigned to the matter. They investigated. They concluded, eventually, that Shirley Temple was in fact a child, that the investigation happened at all, that the resources of the federal government were deployed to determine whether a 9-year-old girl was secretly an adult. She tells you something about how consuming and how strange the phenomenon had become. She was not just a child star, she was a national obsession, and obsessions of that magnitude tend to warp everything they touch. By the time Shirley Temple turned 12, she had earned approximately $3 million. In the currency of the 1930s and early 1940s, that figure represented a fortune almost beyond comprehension. Adjusted for inflation, it would be equivalent to somewhere between $50 and $60 million today. She had generated that money through relentless work, through dozens of films, through years of her childhood spent on studio lots instead of playgrounds. Every smile, every tap step, every perfectly delivered line had been converted into revenue, and virtually none of it was hers. Her father George managed the family finances. He was, after all, a banker. If anyone should have understood how to protect and grow a child's earnings, it was him. The family's lifestyle changed as the money flowed in. They moved to a larger house. They hired staff. They lived in a manner appropriate to the parents of the most famous child in the world. The expenses grew to match the income, and then, by some accounts, to exceed it. There was no meaningful separation between Shirley's money and the family's money. It was all one pool, and the pool had many hands reaching into it. The Coogan Act, the California law that would eventually require a portion of child performers' earnings to be set aside in trust, was passed in 1939. It was named for Jackie Coogan, the child star of the 1920s, who had discovered upon reaching adulthood that his parents had spent virtually everything he had earned. But the Coogan Act came too late for much of Shirley's fortune, and even after it passed, the protections were limited. Parents still controlled the majority of their children's earnings. The law was a gesture toward fairness, not a guarantee of it. When Shirley was old enough to examine her own finances, when she was finally in a position to ask where the money had gone and to expect a real answer, The millions were largely gone. What remained, by the accounts that have surfaced over the decades, was a fraction of what had been earned, a small fraction. A fraction so small that it defied any reasonable explanation rooted in ordinary expenses and prudent management. She never publicly blamed her parents. In her autobiography, she addressed the financial reality without accusation, without rage, with the measured tone of someone who had processed a betrayal so large that anger no longer served any purpose. But the facts spoke for themselves. The money was gone. The child who had earned it never saw it. And then there was the other theft, the one that cost her nothing in dollars and everything in something harder to name. Shirley Temple was born on April the 23rd, 1928. But for years the world believed she had been born in 1929. The studio, seeking to make her seem even younger, even more extraordinary, had altered her birth certificate. They had erased a year of her life as casually as a bookkeeper correcting a clerical error. The lie was maintained for years. It appeared in press materials, in official biographies, and in every article written about her during the height of her fame. Even Shirley herself was uncertain of her real age for a period of her childhood. She had been told so many times that she was a year younger than she actually was, that the truth became slippery, hard to hold on to. They had taken her money, they had taken her childhood, and they had taken her birthday. By the time she was old enough to understand what had been done, there was no one left to hold accountable and no mechanism for getting any of it back. By 1940, the magic was fading. Shirley Temple was 12 years old, and the audience that had adored her as a dimpled toddler was losing interest in watching her grow up. The formula that had worked so perfectly for 6 years, the curls and the songs and the innocent charm, did not translate to adolescence. Her films were still making money, but not the kind of money they had made before. The lines on the graphs were pointing in the wrong direction. Fox decided not to renew her contract. Gertrude, undeterred, took her daughter to MGM. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was the most powerful studio in Hollywood, home to the biggest stars and the most prestigious productions. If anyone could manage the transition from child star to adult actress, it was MGM. Gertrude arranged meetings. She positioned her daughter for what she hoped would be the next chapter. One of those meetings was with Arthur Freed. Freed was one of the most powerful producers at MGM. He had been instrumental in shaping the studio's musical productions and would go on to oversee some of the most celebrated films in Hollywood history. An American in Paris, Singin' in the Rain. The Wizard of Oz had his fingerprints on it. He was, by any industry measure, a man who mattered. Shirley Temple was 12 years old when she walked into his office. What happened next, Shirley described in her autobiography nearly 50 years later. She sat across from Freed while he spoke to her about her potential future at the studio. At some point during the meeting, he stood up from behind his desk, walked toward her, and exposed himself. A grown man, a powerful man, a man whose name would eventually be attached to some of the most beloved films ever made, and a 12-year-old girl who had been brought to his office by her mother, who was waiting somewhere outside, trusting that her daughter was safe. Shirley laughed. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a reflex, the kind of nervous, confused response that a child produces when something happens that she has no frame of reference for understanding. She did not know what she was seeing. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that something was deeply wrong, and her body responded with the only defense it had available. Freed was furious. He ordered her out of the office. The meeting was over. She told her mother. What Gertrude did with that information, what action she took or did not take, what conversations happened behind closed doors in the days and weeks that followed, is not detailed in the autobiography. Shirley did not elaborate. She stated the facts and left the silence around them intact. There is no record of consequences for Arthur Freed. There was no investigation, no scandal, no public reckoning. He continued his career without interruption. He won Academy Awards. He was celebrated for decades as a visionary of the movie musical. He died in 1973, still honored, still remembered as a giant of his industry. In 1940, there was no language for what had happened to Shirley Temple in that office. There was no framework for accountability, no system that would have allowed a 12-year-old girl to report a powerful man and expect to be believed. There was only the meeting and the exposure and the nervous laughter, and then the rest of her life carrying the memory of it. Shirley enrolled at Westlake School for Girls shortly afterward. She was 12 years old, and for the first time in her life, she attended a real school with other children her own age. Her film career sputtered through a few more attempts in her teenage years, but the audiences did not come. While they had wanted the child was gone. And what was left was a young woman trying to figure out who she was when the thing that had defined her entire existence was no longer wanted by anyone. In 1944, Shirley Temple met John Agar at a party. He was 23 years old, a physical training instructor with a wealthy family and aspirations toward an acting career of his own. He was handsome, he was charming. He looked at Shirley and saw a young woman, not the little girl from the movies. For someone who had spent her entire life being treated as a product, being seen as a person must have felt like oxygen. They married on September 19, 1945. Shirley was 17 years old. The wedding was a public event, covered extensively by the press, photographed from every angle. America's former sweetheart was growing up, and the country wanted to watch. What the country did not see, what the cameras were not present for, was what happened after the ceremony. The marriage was troubled almost from the beginning. John Agar drank. He drank frequently, and he drank heavily, and the drinking made him someone other than the charming man Shirley had met at that party. There were reports of infidelity. There were public incidents that could not be hidden. The fairy tale that the press had constructed around the wedding began to fall apart in newspaper headlines. Their daughter, Linda Susan, was born on January 30th, 1948. The marriage did not survive much longer. The divorce was finalized in 1950. Agar's life continued to spiral. He was arrested multiple times for drunk driving in the years that followed. He remarried, divorced again, and drifted through a career that never became what he had hoped it would be. Shirley was 22 years old when her first marriage ended. She had been the most famous child on earth. She had been locked in a punishment box before kindergarten. She had watched her fortune disappear. She had been assaulted by a producer at 12. She had seen her career evaporate because audiences could not accept her as anything other than the child they remembered. And now she was a single mother, with a failed marriage, standing in the wreckage of yet another thing that had promised to be good and turned out to be something else entirely. Most people at 22 are just beginning to figure out who they are. Shirley Temple had already been used up and set aside by an entire industry. And then she met someone who had never seen a single one of her films, and everything changed. In January 1950, at a party in Hawaii, Shirley Temple met Charles Alden Black. He was a businessman from a prominent San Francisco family, a Navy veteran who had served with distinction in the Pacific during the war. He was intelligent, steady, and completely uninterested in Hollywood. When Shirley asked if he had seen any of her films, he told her he had not seen a single one. She later said that was the moment she knew she could trust him. They married on December 16, 1950. The marriage lasted 55 years, until Charles's death in 2005. They had 2 children together, Charles Jr. in 1952 and Laurie in 1954. The household Shirley built with Charles was nothing like the one she had grown up in. There were no studio schedules, and no pin curls, no mothers measuring every gesture against its commercial potential. There was simply a family, living a life that belonged entirely to them. Shirley stepped away from entertainment almost completely. And then she did something no one expected. She entered public service. In 1967, She ran for Congress in California and lost the Republican primary. It did not stop her. In 1969, she was appointed as a United States delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. In 1974, she became the United States ambassador to Ghana. In 1976, she was named Chief of Protocol of the United States, the first woman ever to hold that position. And in 1989, she was appointed ambassador to Czechoslovakia, arriving just months before the Velvet Revolution swept through Eastern Europe. She was there when communism fell. She represented her country during one of the most significant political transformations of the 20th century. The little girl who had been locked in a dark box at 3, assaulted at 12, and discarded by Hollywood before she was old enough to vote, was now representing the United States of America at the highest levels of international diplomacy. In 1972, Shirley Temple Black was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent a modified radical mastectomy, and then she did something that almost no prominent woman had done before. She held a press conference and told the world exactly what had happened to her. In 1972, breast cancer was still something women whispered about. It was a private shame, a diagnosis to be hidden, a word that polite people did not say out loud. Shirley said it out loud. She stood in front of cameras and spoke about her surgery, her prognosis, her determination to survive. She told women that this was something they could face. She told them they did not have to be afraid. She told them they did not have to be silent. She may have saved more lives with that press conference than with any film she ever made. In 1988, Shirley Temple Black published her autobiography, Child Star. She was 60 years old. For the first time, she told the full story. The black box, the assault, the stolen money, the forged birth certificate, the loneliness that lived underneath the smile. She had carried these stories for more than half a century before she put them on paper. The weight of that silence is difficult to comprehend. Charles Alden Black died on August 4, 2005. He was 86 years old. They had been married for 55 years. Shirley Temple Black died on February 10, 2014, at her home in Woodside, California. She was 85 years old, natural causes, surrounded by family. Not the family that had been constructed around her by a studio and a stage mother, and an industry that never once asked a little girl what she wanted. The family she had chosen, the family she had built, the family that belonged to her. What history remembers is the curls, the dimples, on the good ship Lollipop, the little girl who tap-danced her way through the Depression and made a nation smile. What history tends to forget is the ice in the punishment box, the producer's open trousers, the empty bank account, the forged birth certificate, the marriage at 17, the years of having no childhood at all, because every hour of every day belonged to someone else's plan. She was not just America's little sweetheart. She was America's child. And America, like a great many parents, loved the performance more than it protected the performer. That she survived all of it, that she built a real life on the other side, a life of purpose and service and love that lasted 5 decades, is not the fairy tale. It is something better. It is the truth. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.